Since it was the body of neither a working-class mother nor a middle-class wife, but that of the female dancer that had attracted me from childhood through adolescence, I cannot but wonder if unrealizing that I would not be a dancer. I somehow imagined that as a professor I could turn myself inside out, like a reversible garment, and cloak my female body in what I believed, via courses and grades, to be my genderless and classless mind. While traces of this desire remain, it nonetheless comes as something of a surprise to realize that I am never more my mother's daughter than when I am writing the essays, papers, lectures, books that organize my academic life. I realize that I must have learned to write from watching my mother sew. What I saw, or now believe I must have seen, was a woman whose pleasure while sewing matched mine while playing. I suppose what I remember is seeing her thoroughly at ease, for the woman who sewed was entirely different from the one who cooked, cleaned, shopped, talked, and cared for her children. That woman was preoccupied, often weary and worried, and awkward in the presence of strangers. The woman who sewed was none of these. This woman would discuss ideas that animated her long before she ever spread out the newspapers she saved for her patterns, bought the fabric, laid out the pieces on the bias, cut the cloth, hand-basted and machine-stitched the darts and seams of garment. Sewing relieved the tyranny of money over my mother's life. She made all her children's clothes by copying ready-to-wear clothing, except her seams were more generous and her hems deeper, so they could be let out as we grew. My mother never thought of herself as, or allowed anyone to call her, a seamstress. It may have been undue modesty on her part, or she may have preferred her high standing among local amateurs to joining the ranks of anonymous professionals. But I like to think it is because she knew seamstresses do not sew to please themselves, and my mother pleased herself when she sewed. I can remember no time during my childhood when my mother was not sewing. Our clothes, our doll clothes, our costumes for Halloween and school plays, and my dance recitals, not to mention First Communion dresses, confirmation dresses, outfits for Easter and Christmas, party dresses and formals. Dresses, skirts, blouses, and trousers hung perfectly. We were given to understand only when she found and cut the cloth on the bias. The clothes, the doll clothes, and the costumes were all given equal attention, each made as if it were to last forever and to be viewed by an eye as appreciative of detail as my mother's. When I think about this aesthetic as a tribute to her children's acuity, I regret even more the careless indifference each of us assumed during adolescence to these tokens of her esteem. She was literally outclassed by the inexpensive, ready-to-wear clothing that devalued and finally supplanted homemade clothes, and simultaneously the one domestic practice at which my mother thrived. In the midsummer, my mother would take each of her girls on a day-long shopping trip that she always referred to as buying our back-to-school clothes. It must have been her little joke, because she bought nothing at the department stores and children's shops whose stock inspired her copies. Instead, we were directed to try on the school clothes and party dresses we liked, for size. I never saw her make a sketch or take a note. Yet even now I can see my mother examining garments, turning them inside out to scrutinize the mysteries of design before bustling off to buy fabric. She required us to look at and feel all fabrics she considered suitable and to compare endless combinations of and variations in texture, hue, and print. Selections of fabrics prefaced even more lengthy discussions of the relative merits of threads, buttons, belts, sashes, laces, piping, decals. These periodic conversations my mother held with each of her girls amidst folds of cloth exuding the fumes of dye and sizing were supremely pedagogical, for she sought nothing less during those lessons than our full allegiance to the axiology that measures worth in finely wrought distinctions known only to those with intimate knowledge of production. The value of a garment is in its stitchery, which is not solely a measure of competence, but also of practice. One slipped stitch spoiled a garment for my mother, and she wanted us to value such details of production. That aesthetic was disappearing even as my mother was teaching it to her children. a fact brought home to her as each of us in turn succumbed to the aesthetic of fashion on entering adolescence. None of my mother's children would fully appreciate her aesthetic again until we were adults, and my own appreciation has been tempered with varieties of remorse. I lack the skill, the capital, and even the patience to clothe myself with the rigorous attention to detail I learned from my mother. Yet I am never more confident than when I am wearing something I believe she would admire. It is less a particular style of clothing than the certitude that my mother could tell just from the hang of it that I have not forgotten how much depends on the bias. While few garments I own would please my mother, that my best essays are written on the bias would. Even more than what I finally produce, that I do not even attempt to write an essay until I have found a bias would please her, for my practice as a writer is as intricately tied to seeking and following oblique lines that cut across the grain as was my mother's. A girl can, it seems, learn a great deal about work and its pleasures from watching her mother sew. If I enjoy the labor of writing, that can at least in part be explained by my writing as my mother sewed. She made clothes, I make prose. There is a sense in which, just as my mother was always sewing, I am always writing.